you for having me here today. I've been very impressed with all the speakers who have not brought notes to the stage. I will not be one of them. I'm going to throw out, I've got to say it in 7, which I've gotten down to 8.5 minutes. I'm going to try and throw out a number of resources to help you go and do some further research about some of these topics that we're going to bring up today. And in particular, I'm going to throw out the ones that have been seminal for me in the last few years. I'm Elizabeth Kellison, or Liz Kellison. I'm the gender lead on the Financial Services for the Poor team at the Bill and Miranda Gates Foundation. I'm going to talk a little bit today about gender equality, financial inclusion, and women's economic empowerment, and then introduce our excellent set of panelists for a further discussion about financial inclusion. Interesting. Should I be seeing on screen what is, no? There it is, okay, good. So at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we believe the guiding principle for us is that all lives have equal value. And we believe a significant driver of inequality and poverty is financial exclusion. There are 1.7 billion people worldwide that lack access to basic financial services that we all enjoy so freely, such as savings, payments, insurance, and credit. Without formal financial histories, they are cut off from potential opportunities to build credit or get a loan to start a business. And that is why the Financial Services for the Poor team exists at the Gates Foundation, and our goal is that by 2030, we want to ensure that 80% of adults worldwide and 65% of the sub $2.50 a day adults in the world have access to and use a digital account for services beyond just payments. Oh, there we go. Okay. Our theory of change, we work in 3 main areas, which you can see on the left of this slide. We work in policy and regulation globally. We work in infrastructure. We have launched a payments platform, a pro-poor payments platform, say that 3 times quickly, called Mojaloop, which we're working to put into a lot of geographies around the world, and I'll show you some of the places that we're working to do that. We also do quite a bit of private sector engagement to help create compelling business propositions for the private sector to engage in the developing world. I work specifically where you see that handy little red arrow that I put in this slide, that to make the usage of digital financial services ubiquitous by women and girls. And by 2030, we are trying to eliminate the gender gap in usage of DFS. So I wanted to give you a quick scan of the 6 key areas and the kinds of investments we make. We have 8 focus countries, 4 in Asia, Indonesia, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and 4 in Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. Those have been picked for the size of their populations in poverty and the number of unbanked in those countries, as well as for innovation in payments and banking for the poor, such as in East Africa. We do quite a bit of work, as I said, in policy and regulation, digital payment infrastructure. Don't ask me what's going on now with Huawei and the new restrictions in the United States. I forgot to ask our team before I left Seattle. Do quite a bit of work in DFS usage and new technologies. And in gender, quite a bit of investments focused on women's economic empowerment. I wanted to show you specifically for this audience where we were working on infrastructure in Africa. We're working with quite a few of the regional economic commissions, SADC and COMESA in the south, the EAC in East Africa, WAMU in West Africa to put into place that payment system I talked about. There's quite an opportunity right now in Africa, quite a lot of digital infrastructure being put in, quite a few governments trying to work together on interoperability, led by some of these regional economic bodies. There's 5 pillars to our work in Africa: payments infrastructure, identity infrastructure, enabling regulations, research, and a lot of work to reduce that gender gap. So let's turn to why inequality matters, and not just because we should be equal and it's the right thing to do. But how does gender equality actually hit us economically? And I would point you on this slide to the really fantastic set of reports that the McKinsey Global Institute did in 2015, 2016, called The Power of Parity. And they calculated that if women were fully functioning in their economies around the world, we would add $28 trillion of additional GDP, which is equivalent to the combined US and China economies today, just by having all those women fully participate. And if all countries simply matched the best in region country that was near them, we would add $12 trillion to global GDP. So this is an economic case as well for why gender equality matters. So how is financial inclusion doing in the world? We have, at the Gates Foundation, we have helped create and fund the global Findex database at the World Bank. And we started gathering data in 2011. And the good news is that the 2017 Global Findex showed that 1.2 billion adults have gotten an account since 2011, right? So that's great news. That has really increased. Account ownership has risen globally in that time, so that's good news. And what's driving many of these new accounts is digital technology. Which is also fantastic news, except that it does mean, when I start showing you the gender gap, it does mean if you think about digital technology driving that financial inclusion conversation, that what we're really talking about here is participation in the digital economy, right? It's not just about financial inclusion. It's about, do you have access to and can you participate in that digital economy? And you can see a couple of places where digital payments have increased globally from 67 to 76%. In China, there's been a huge explosion in digital payments as well. And about 1.85 billion adults around the world have access to the internet, all of which is great. However, women are still less likely than men to have a bank account. The gender gap in developing economies has remained unchanged since 2011. It's still stuck at about 9%. So what does this mean to it? Does this mean that women are not making progress? No. Women are making progress. They are gaining accounts, but they are not. Men in many geographies are gaining accounts faster than women. They're accelerating faster, and we're not closing that gap. So you can see in many markets that gender gap is increasing. We did see in the 2017 Global Findex there was some good news. In India, the gender gap fell from 20 percentage points to 6. In Indonesia, women actually have a higher percentage of accounts than men, so that's great. But in most economies and in most developing economies, that gap was either staying the same or growing wider. So what are the barriers and risks for women in that digital ecosystem? There's a lot of them. I'm going to point out a few of them, and then our panelists are going to talk about some of the ways to overcome them. But if you think about, specifically in the 8 focus countries I talked about, there's a lot of mistrust in banks and the banking system and in financial systems. And especially as we introduce digital technologies into that world, which many poor women already believe is sort of a man's world, they don't trust handing over their PIN or handing over their mobile phone or their phone number to men who are primarily male cash-in, cash-out agents. So there's a lot of distrust in the system we have to get over. In terms of legal barriers, let's just take one, property rights. In many countries in the developing world, women aren't playing on the same playing field as men. The inheritance rights and the property rights are different between men and women, so that a lack of control over property will contribute to a woman's lack of assets, which will then affect their ability to access capital and credit to build their businesses, right? So one legal thing runs a whole chain down to women not being able to build and grow business as much as they would like to. And that's just one legal barrier that we have. We've done some work on a variety of legal barriers around the world to financial inclusion, and that's just one of them. Another one that we've started seeing more and more of, social and cultural norms, and how those can prevent low-income women from participating more in their digital economy and being financially included. And I want to point out to you a fantastic report that was published in 2018 by the Evidence for Policy Design, or EPOD, E-P-O-D, called A Tough Call. They did a study on mobile phone ownership in India, where 71% of men own a phone to only 38% of women. And one of the things that they found, they studied both normative as well as economic barriers. So economic barriers were real. Phones cost a certain amount, and women had less cash to spend on phones than men did. Only they found that empowerment and how empowered, the level of empowerment a woman felt, was just as important as her income in whether or not she owned a phone. And they did this really interesting study, or they did an analysis in their report on how mobile phone usage challenges traditional gender norms. Gender norms of purity before marriage, how having a phone and using a phone actively where your community sees it will challenge that gender norm. Gender norms after marriage, where women are supposed to be taking care of their household and not supposed to be outside talking on a phone, even if it's a productive conversation. So I would point your attention to that report. It was fascinating. They also offer some ideas at the end about how to try and overcome some of those social and cultural barriers. Another thing I would point out, mental models. Men and women have different mental models about what finances and what access to the internet means. Another fascinating report, actually from 2015, but I think it's still true now, from GSMA. They did a report on mobile internet usage, and they found that more often in the developing world, women had sort of more limited mental models than men about what was on the internet and what they could do with information and what they could access. So I would say that's a terrific report to read as well. Another barrier in the system for women, identification. Foundational ID systems can be instrumental in making women visible to the financial system, and our panelists are going to talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes. Lastly, female representation in financial services. A number of speakers have mentioned that today. It is critical that we work very hard both to up the number of women in positions of leadership and power in financial service companies as well as in central banks. There is a dearth of female central bankers that organizations like the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, which is the association of central banks working on financial inclusion, is trying hard to overcome. But those things matter. So what do we do about this? What do we do to begin to change? Let me just go back for a minute. This, to me, is a long list that, as I got into the gender work in the financial services team, sort of brought me down. Where do you even begin to work against some of these things? And what we've decided to do at the Gates Foundation on the financial service teams is we decided about 2 years ago as part of our women's economic empowerment strategy to digitize predictable income streams for low-income women. So the money is already coming from government and going into a woman's account. Cash transfer programs generally used to be paid in cash. More governments are now digitizing those programs. And we decided that if we were working in 3 countries were to digitize payment streams and help women understand how to use their accounts and design those programs so that they worked better for low-income women, we'd be able to overcome some of those barriers that I talked about a little bit earlier. We're working in 3 countries. Why I picked 3 such disparate countries, I don't know. But we picked some real doozies: Pakistan, India, and Tanzania, each of which has a very large program that they run for low-income women. And they're anxious to both digitize that program, direct the payments into women's accounts, and design the program so that it works better for women. And I hope I'm going to be here next year and give you some good progress reports on those three things. This is essentially our hypothesis, digitize, direct, and design. And we may be working on wage payments as well, using some of those hypotheses. So let's turn now to what can you do? What can your companies do? I've sort of outlined the problem. We're going to talk about solutions and some ideas with my fantastic set of panelists, whom I will now invite to the stage. I'll sit here. So I'm going to introduce them and then moderate a panel with them. But before I do that, I'm going to tell you 4 facts about these amazing women. And then during the panel, you're going to have to guess which fact connects to which person. So on this panel, I have a serious hiker and downhill skier. We have a trained hypnotherapist. If you start to feel sleepy, look away. One runs half marathons regularly. That's not me. And another is a former national team handball player. No fear looking up on the internet who is who. But you're going to have to, as they talk, you're going to have to figure out who is who. So I first want to introduce Suzanne Hannestad. Suzanne is the CEO at FinTech Mundi, chair of the board at Payer, Vio, and board director at Crunchfish, Neonomics, and Blipit. She's the former executive chairman at Zwipe, building the Zwipe payment for global scale, and she was a board member at MasterCard Europe and Nordax. Welcome, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Next to her, we've got Nina Rudanko, the co-founder of the FinTech Finland Association. Nina has 20-plus years of experience in financial markets. Her previous positions include the head of sales of equity markets, as well as business control of NASDAQ commodities, where she has been a member of the management team, responsible for financial planning, and an active player in forming the global strategy. Welcome, Nina.
Thank you.
Next to her, we have Seema Kinda-Johnson, co-founder and COO at Nuggets, which is a blockchain payments and digital ID platform that's redefining online security and privacy. Nuggets will make the future safer and simpler for everyone. Is that true, Seema?
It is.
Consumers and business alike. Before founding Nuggets, Seema spent more than 20 years leading teams and delivering large-scale commercialization products, campaigns, and projects with brands like Skype and Microsoft. Welcome, Seema.
Yeah, morning, everyone.
And on the end there, save the best for last. Nelixa Devlukia is an experienced lawyer and regulatory expert. She's currently the head of regulatory at Open Banking. She has a master's in European competition law and over 20 years of banking and payments experience. She's worked in industry with regulators and legislators to drive changes in the payments ecosystem for a payments landscape that is secure, transparent, and inclusive, my 3 favorite terms. So I'm going to turn to them and ask questions. We are going to have about 15 minutes, she says checking her watch, maybe 10 minutes of conversation. We would love to open up the room for questions. Is that possible? Okay, great. And we'd love to do that at the end, so please start thinking of your questions now. So I'm going to start with Suzanne. Suzanne just ran, I believe it was the first time, a very successful summit in Oslo last month, Financial Inclusion from Access to Economic Empowerment. And I would love to know, Suzanne, any insights that you have and the people who participated in the summit last month had that might touch upon some of the real barriers and risks that I outlined earlier.
Thank you for that, Liz. We had 300 participants from 30 countries. And why did we choose to have this in Oslo? The Nordics, they are doing great when it comes to cashless society, humanitarian aid, fantastic fintechs, and we had invited 34 fintechs from the Nordics, meaning Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, the 3 Baltic states, and Iceland. And they presented, quite a few of them were female founders, and they have all kinds of solutions for the financial inclusion. So then bridging, because funding is a key thing, Gates Foundation is good at that, and then also the Nordic governments are good at funding, but or investing money through organizations or directly, like into African Development Bank, and then but you also need the private money. So the collaboration between the private and the governmental, that is a key thing. And then you have the technology. It has to be design-led. It has to be access. You said that quite a lot is having accounts now, but the usage is still low. So you have to raise the awareness in all kinds of ways. Regulation is one that you were talking about. So that was a section that we went deep into. We had the World Economic Forum coming there and speaking from their view and their insights, and we had the International Banking Federation coming and looking. So then we had cases from Southeast Asia, India, and Africa, and of course Latin America. There are variations in how far they have come. Mexico is a case that World Economic Forum is highlighting quite well, because they are maturing, but the corruption is still so high, so the financial inclusion is going the wrong way. So how can you help the Mexican? You need all players, all stakeholders to be part of it. The government with the policies, the regulations and so forth, and also money. You need the financial industry, financial services. You need the funding. You need the fintechs, because they can come and provide the solution for it. And then have this whole ecosystem to work together. I think that was one of the major insights coming from the summit.
Well, I think you underscoring the importance of the public and the private working together is so critically important. And I find that we're not doing it well enough yet, and we need to be doing it better. Maybe we can turn to Seema, who is one of the privates, and hear sort of your perspective on that, and also how can blockchain, other technologies be leveraged to reach low-income women?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you talked a lot, Liz, and we've heard throughout the day how...
Did I talk too much?
No. You talked a lot about not too much.
Okay.
You informed us, and it was brilliant. So I think the thing is, the core of all of this, I think, is identity. Without the identity, you can't participate in fundamental human rights, whether that's access to education, to financial services, to government services. So I think if we talk about identity first, and then we can talk about how we can leverage emerging technologies to solve that problem, but you've got over 1 billion people without an official identity, and that's huge, right? I mean, that's crazy that in this day and age there's over 1 billion people, and they are mostly women and children, without access to those fundamental human rights. So I think we absolutely have a massive job on our hands. And we can look to something like a DLT technology like blockchain, which has a number of inherent qualities, like the fact that it can track and store anything of value, and that could be a land title, that could be starting a digital identity, it could be starting a cryptographic reputation model, so you can potentially gain access to credit when you've never participated in that, the traditional financial system. So I think blockchain is a great technology, DLT technology, that you can start a digital identity on. And there's some brilliant use cases already in the developing world. There's actually a beautiful project that I'm a massive admirer of. It's called ID Box. It's in Papua New Guinea. It can work without any electricity, any internet connection. and a government official or a charity goes round to the villages, and it's a little box with a biometric reader that's connected to a 2G mobile device. So they've already started basically getting people to participate in this and giving them, they print off a card which has a digital identity on, and already people are getting access to government services, able to go online. So there's already beautiful projects happening, and I think with all of these are very useful use cases that we can take to public agencies, government, and we can take them as things to show, look, there's a real proof and a real use case here of how we can include versus us looking at some of the technologies that are great when you've got a smartphone.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's super important.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful to hear about fintech companies coming up with different solutions.
Yeah.
I wonder, Nina, have you seen the fintech companies that you oversee, sort of in your association, engaging in use cases to solve these problems? What are some of the opportunities you're seeing?
Yeah, there is a number of opportunities, and I would like to lift up one concrete case, which is a Danish company called Hive Online. And they are working with the poorest of the poor. They are working with the women in Niger, and some of their end clients are illiterate. They actually can't read and write right now. So Sophie Blackstad, who is one of the founders, and her team have developed a way of communication where you can use symbols until you learn to read and write, because these women are smart, even if they are illiterate, and they are very eager to learn. And these kind of services to give access to finance, to loans, microloans and savings in these kind of very poor countries, it really untaps the potential to found a small business, to make a living and just to see a better future, because we also need to create optimism in a country that is mostly Sahara and really a poor country. So I would say that fintechs play here a major role because they are so innovative, but they definitely need, as you said, Susanne, they definitely need partners, and in this case, Hive Online works with Care Denmark, because they don't have the money and they don't have the structure. So you really need to combine the innovative part, the innovations come from fintechs, and the willingness to help the world, really, and then you need partners. That's just one example, but there are a number of problems to solve. So I see a number of opportunities to fintechs, and some fintechs might consider themselves too small because these problems are huge. But if we manage to matchmake the ideas and the non-governmental organizations or governmental organizations who can help, then I think it's doable.
And I suppose, Suzanne, there was a lot of matchmaking going on in Oslo.
It is. Of course, this was a huge opportunity for networking. So
we helped with some of the introductions and so forth between the private and the public and fintechs with the various NGOs and so forth. So very good. And we had MasterCard with us as one of the partners, and they were hugely making the rise of potential networks as well.
So speaking of yet another problem to solve, one of the things I hear a lot is, how are we going to protect low-income women from being taken advantage of in this new system? And frankly, I don't know the answer to that, and I'm hoping Nelixa has that answer. Not to put you, no pressure really at all. But
Absolutely.
it'd be great to hear, what are your thoughts on the consumer protection side on this? How do you bring people along the journey that we're describing, consumers who may be illiterate and who may be innumerate? How do we ensure that they are protected?
It's a massive question, that. And I think that there are lots of different layers that we can talk about. We've got, if we're talking about inclusion around digitization and the provision of services you mentioned in your presentation, then you've got the very basics protections of, security and how that's dealt with. It should be baked into how the products are formulated, baked into the technology being used. But I think then you've got the layer up of, if we look at consumer protection, say for low-income families in developed countries, I'm not sure that that's literally a drag and drop. We need to think about the societal norms, the legal frameworks that are applicable to the jurisdiction we're talking about. You touched upon it yourself, Liz, that actually if there are jurisdictions in which women cannot hold property, they cannot hold a bank account, then actually the consumer protection framework, one, is going to be very, very different. But actually, to bring about that inclusion and empowerment that we're talking about is a much bigger social political debate about how do we change these underlying infrastructures that actually cause the inequality in the first place. And it was interesting because Amy, some of the initiatives she talked about in her presentation about technology and the biometrics and taking the picture, because not everybody has a smartphone. Right. You mentioned it yourself, the cost of technology. So I think there's a lot of other factors that need to be considered and taken into account. And then you think about, well, what is the protection framework we need? And actually, what do these people need to be protected from? You know, in the UK, we have things like authorised push payment fraud. That's probably not a main concern for these initiatives. So it's really, really got to be relevant to the case in hand. And then you mentioned about bringing people along. And the big thing for me is about building trust. It's no point in having, oh, we've got this piece of legislation and it protects you all from X, Y, and Z. If nobody knows about it, if nobody can access it, is one point. But also, you talked yourself about trust in the system. You have to trust that if something goes wrong, I can go to someone and they will help me. And I think that, you know, this whole debate about inclusion, empowerment, is all linked. It's a virtuous circle. As we get it right, it builds and it gains momentum. And unfortunately, if we get it wrong, it has the exact opposite effect. And what we're looking for is to build outcomes. You know, outcomes are the very, very focus of what we should be looking for. And actually to build it holistically. You know, lots of FinTech going on, lots of digital initiatives going on. But actually, are they cutting across each other? Are they working together to actually get to a socio-economic outcome that the government is looking for or a foundation is looking for? So it's a really, really big debate and topic. But I really think that the first thing we need to think about is what are the needs we need to address and what are the outcomes that we're looking for?